Welcome to READ, the Research, Education, Advocacy podcast. READ connects you with researchers, educators, and thought leaders on topics in education and child development. I'm your host, Dr. Danielle Gomez. You know, READ is produced by the Windward Institute, and I am joined by, I think, a researcher that I've wanted to talk to, years, I would say. I'll give you a little bit of a backstory. Dr. Stephanie Otaiba is sitting on Zoom with me, and I'm excited to introduce her. But we officially met Dr. Otaiba at the International Dyslexia Association conference, where you were running a poster presentation. And I highlighted that poster presentation. I had my booklet, and I think I ran up to you. I was just the most excited to meet you. And I'm excited for our READ guests to meet you as well. So Dr. Otaiba, welcome to the READ podcast.
Thank you. Please feel free to call me Steph.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, I feel like we're, research best friends already, So Steph, I've learned so much from you already, and I know many, if not all of our READ guests will know who you are. But actually, I'd like to first set the scene. Where are you in the world? How are you showing up this conversation?
Sure. I'm actually in the home office at home today. And so I'm in Dallas, Texas. I'm a faculty member at Southern Methodist University. And it's becoming a sunnier day, and I'm just happy to be able to join you.
Thank you for being here. Did you bring tea, or do you have your pup next to you? I know you have a dog.
I do have my dog mom mug, yes.
Yay, I'm so happy. I didn't bring my dog mom mug. In honor of us meeting at Dallas, our team, actually our director of the Windward Institute, made this Team IDA Dallas, Texas 2024 mug. So I have my peppermint tea here. I don't know if the readers can see it, but I'll just go like this a couple times. Harry, my colleague, is laughing at me as I'm showing my tea, and I'm glad you have your dog. But so Southern Methodist University, you've been such a prominent researcher there. And so I'd like for you to share with us your story, your journey of your professional background, and really to where it leads you up today.
Sure. So I first started volunteering and teaching in education when I was living in the Middle East. I worked with the United Nations developing programs as they were starting to roll out education for students with disabilities in Abu Dhabi. And then I went on to get some Montessori training in the UK, went back, did some more teaching, got my master's degree, went back and did more teaching and did a little teacher training. And then when I moved back to the US, I came back to Vanderbilt University to do my PhD. I studied with Doug and Lynn Fuchs. And really got interested in thinking about how children learn to read and how things were easier for some than others. When I taught in the Middle East, the kids had a very transparent letter sound orthography. And so I was curious about how that would influence how kids learn to read. And I worked in a variety of settings, but generally in kind of inclusive settings. And maybe my interest in dyslexia specifically is because my dad was dyslexic. We haven't had, I don't have kids, but I've got a niece and nephew, and they haven't had that challenge. But I think that's always kept me interested and like I said, sort of having a chance to travel and experience some different cultures.
That is so interesting. I didn't know that you started your work with the UN Development Program. I'm sure that's I think it's a unique way to kind of see the world. And when you talked about the transparent letters and reading, that's really fascinating for me. I'd like to know a little bit more about where if you had this, I hate to say elevator pitch, but just really share some of the areas of focus of your research. And then was there a pivotal moment in your career that shaped your approach to literacy research?
Sure. So, yeah, I think definitely I really enjoy the early childhood and elementary developmental space and learning the relationships between language and literacy. I enjoy learning about what works well and helps children, and then the surprising times when something that generally works well doesn't seem to be as helpful for some children, and trying to almost think like a detective about what are some things that we could do to fine tune things. So I think a pivotal moment for me was when I was at Vanderbilt and beginning to think about dissertation work. And I really became interested, as I say, where peer assisted learning strategies was so widely um, uh, helpful, that there were a couple of kids that really saw early on that they weren't learning to read as fast as some of their colleagues. And trying to it was very humbling to see how they might shut down, or their sense of self-efficacy or feeling smart was so tied in with their success or lack thereof. And for just the little guys to get a light bulb over their head that this is hard for me, but it's not hard for my partner, or it's not hard for my classmates. Um, I think that was a probably a pivotal moment, that has propelled my research and probably encouraged my own perseverance.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, you know, when I think of your research and when I dive into, let's say, if I'm doing a literature review of something or a research analysis, I regularly see your name come up because I think one of the unique aspects of you as a researcher is you are detective, right? Like you are understanding those students who may be the slow responders, who may have various facets of not only their reading ability, but like you said, maybe their sense of self-efficacy. And so I really appreciate that about your work. And so thank you for all that you've contributed to that.
Can I also interrupt and just say, I think part of what's also motivated my work is that I've been so fortunate to work with so many really cool researchers. I know later on you guys are going to have my colleague and friend Jeannie Wanzik on. I still continue to be affiliated with the Florida Center for Reading Research that's done such wonderful work. But gosh, I've got colleagues across the country that are smarter than me, that work really hard, that, and I think we just together are able to do more. So um, thank you very much for welcoming me again today.
Of course. You said cool researchers. I like that. You're a cool researcher yourself. So, we mentioned Dr. Wanzek, and you're right. She will be our 2025 Robert J. Schwartz annual lecturer on April 9th, right, Harry? Or is it 8th? It's the 9th. I'm like, where's the dates these days? So, for our readers, we will have something at the end for you to register for that. But Steph, your research supports this early identification and intervention of reading disabilities, really focusing on those characteristics of effective interventions. Speaking of Dr. Wanzek, you co-authored a book called Intensive Interventions for the Elementary Grades, as well with Dr. Kristen McMaster. And when I think about early identification, I think one of maybe the misnomers or the challenges is that we see that students are identified, right? That there's an incredible emphasis on early identification, early screening. And then we also need to ensure that there's this appropriate structures and supports that are in place to target these areas of difficulty, right? You have to have both sides. And so,
Yeah.
what do you mean by intensive intervention? Are you focusing on students who might show risks and then you're immediately intervening, or is it meaning more of a broader term for students?
So that I think that's a really good question. And I think how that plays out in different school settings and in different pieces of legislation, it can differ. But when Kristen and Jeannie and I wrote the book, we were really thinking about what can be done in real world settings where, as you say, there's a balance between being able to follow a structured approach, and then how might you consider differentiating that approach that's already proven to work to make it even more explicit and systematic. And so, just kind of, I might throw out a few questions that we asked in the book that teachers might be asking themselves, regardless of whether they're in the elementary school space, even pre-K, or middle school, high school. Does the student need more time in intervention? So sometimes, we run out of time in a school day. So how can we give kids more time at the teacher table or more intensive support? How can a teacher perhaps change the group size to give the child more opportunities to respond, or the teacher more opportunities to really target feedback? How could a teacher provide even more explicit instruction, really pulling things apart into the very smallest details and giving a child or a student many opportunities to come back and review, um, helping them see words, for example, in connected text in books, maybe also in some other formats, so they get a chance to deconstruct and reconstruct, decode, and encode words. Do they need more opportunities for cumulative review? Do they need um, more specific and corrective feedback than the average bear, right? And that can vary based on the specific skills where you're working. I think we've all probably taught in classrooms where there's been a child or two that have been really silent and they've sort of sponged or copied off of other kids. So sometimes in those smaller groups, you can really see what a student knows and hasn't yet gotten. And then we also talked about trying to support cognitive processes for kids, helping them understand what strategies are successful, and helping support very explicitly teaching transfer. So if you do teach a word that the children are practicing sounding out, and it's a simple word, that they get to see it many times in connected text. So those are some examples of ways that you could take a program that's already structured, but further customize it, or break down into even smaller groups.
Yeah, I love that. I'm taking copious notes. So, to summarize, I love all of these components that you outlined here. Time, right? Decrease in group size, increase in explicit instruction, vary opportunities for students to practice across contexts, cumulative review. I love this piece of corrective feedback too, because, I just have a personal interest in feedback, but in terms of timing, right, particularly for students who are new learners or need that additional practice and repetition, feedback is something that's, I think, one of those like micro but mighty strategies, right? That as teachers, sometimes we often underestimate just how powerful that can be. So I love that. I also like this idea of the cognitive processes and strategies for transfer. Can you flesh that out a little bit more? I'm curious what you mean by that.
Sure. So, like, if let's say, for example, specifically in the area of reading, if we've been practicing decoding and spelling very simple CVC words, trying to help kids be able to access some sentences to read in some connected text, some books. I can provide some examples later on from a couple of different curriculums that might provide opportunities for kiddos to read a word, to play a game, to play another, what looks like a game, but it's really another type of a lesson, but making it feel fun, and then helping them attribute, oh, you really used that strategy. You remembered what that first sounded like. You remembered when it was a blend or when it was a digraph. It didn't trick you, right? You really stuck with it. So thinking about incorporating that rather than letting a child struggle and read a word incorrectly or misunderstand. Sometimes a kid will decode a word that they don't know the meaning of, and it can be real quick to say, no, that's not quite right. This is what we mean. If we're talking about a construction site, you might think about people that are there and working. So structure is what they're building when they're constructing, right? So I think you can paraphrase and help kids get to a word that they know. It's almost like a word neighborhood, um, uh, so that they know what they're trying to read.
Yeah. Love that. Almost that reinforcing that schema of that strategy and that content and that knowledge.
Yeah.
Um, I'm curious. Actually, I love this piece too. I was reminded of the National Center of Intensive Interventions, where they've paired that data and the sequence of all those pieces. What in your research, and I should say, there are probably a lot of people listening who can think of a few students that are slow responders or continue to struggle. Thematically, in your research, what are some of those characteristics of students that may be maybe slower to respond to interventions?
I think it really can vary, first of all, depending on your school context. And what I mean by that is we might be working in a context where half the kiddos in our classroom might be learning English while they're also learning to read. That's a whole nother kind of set of circumstances, one that's very common, for example, here in Dallas, where I live, but it might be less common somewhere else. So I think thinking about the language experiences that children are bringing to school, not from a deficit point of view, but from a fund of strength, when kids can go back and forth across languages, that's definitely a strength. But some children might need more support for vocabulary or to understand syntax in English. On the other hand, we might have kids that are really struggling on the understanding the letters and sounds in their relationships, or understanding when a particular rule that they might have been taught, especially as they get into sort of second, third grade. Some kids might have experienced a lot of instruction that was very rule based, and they may not understand the need to, hey, let's back up a step and be a bit more of a flexible decoder. If this doesn't work, what other tools can I bring to the table, to try to figure out a word using a broader kind of sense of decoding.
Hmm. When you keep coming back to this, I keep coming back to the word detective, right? What I appreciate in what you're talking about is that I'm trying to think of not a sequence, and it's not necessarily rules, but you're providing a framework. There we go. A framework to understand why or how children may have difficulty, and also understanding the strengths that they bring, and then being flexible in how then teachers could apply some of these interventions. So I love that you really characterized some of those difficulties in students in that way. In your research, you have tested some of the work on interventions for students with intellectual disabilities. So can you share some of what you've learned from that area of research?
Sure. And I'm going to kind of go down to one of my little cheat sheets here so that I can get to the specifics, and I'll share a little bit more with you guys in a slide later on. But I also, while we were at the International Dyslexia Association, we had another session talking about what can work for kids with intellectual disabilities. And so it may take children with lower IQs longer to respond. They may need even more practice or even more explicit instruction. But a colleague and I, two colleagues and I, Jill Allure and Jennifer Cheatham, have co-authored a curriculum. So again, I just full disclosure, this is something I've co-authored, so I just want to share that up front. It's called Friends on the Block, and we wrote a series of books that included words that could be decoded and some words that initially were more words that children might learn by sight. Until they could eventually decode them, but they got into connected text right away. And we had lots of games that we developed. We also had some scaffolds for children, such as adults would read part of the text that was a little bit longer and more complex to carry the storyline. We had similar characters that the kids would read about. Those were the friends on the block, including actually my dog, Jazz. And so the kids were able to read quite a bit of fiction that would be including a lot of the vocabulary and decodable words that were at a particular instructional place for them. And once they succeeded at learning those letters and sounds and words, they'd moved to a more challenging set of books. We also included some nonfiction books that include social stories. So for an example of one was, what do you do if you get lost in a store? Or how do you make a pizza? Or how would you care for a pet? Or what is it like going on a vacation or your first airplane ride? So some lived experiences that would be common for a lot of children. And we designed this, we tested it out with research partners that were our teachers, classroom teachers. So they helped us work out a lot of bugs and figure out what was going to be engaging. We incorporated quite a bit of dialogic reading types of questions to really get kids to engage, retell the stories. And we've been really excited. We've been conducting a large federally funded study of research that's ongoing. And our initial findings have shown that the children who participated in Friends on the Block, compared to kids that were in the really good business as usual instructional settings, that the kids in Friends on the Block actually outperformed by a whole standard deviation on oral reading fluency and about 3/4 of a standard deviation on reading comprehension. So these kids are by and large moving into being able to read fluently at a second or third grade level within a year to a year and a half. So I hope that will really encourage your listeners to know that programs that are consistent with the structure of literacy, a lot of teachers are getting a lot of professional development right now, that can work for a broader array of kids, provided that we still keep thinking about like what is the intensity. So it might not only be how many days a week are we giving instruction or how long. We might have to break it up into more smaller chunks or continue across a longer period of time. But we've been very excited, and I'll have a slide to share with you that will provide teachers with some free materials. But again, as I say, full disclosure, we've got an interest in that. We've developed that particular curriculum together.
Thank you for sharing that. I like at the end that you talked about the structured aspect of the program as well as the intensity. I wrote down. I was wondering, as you were talking specifically, when you found those types of conclusions, what perhaps you could say to teachers or to educators across programs in terms of like fidelity of implementation or your theory of treatment. Like, what were those aspects beyond intensity and structure that you found yielded the greatest outcomes?
I think bringing up fidelity is a good point. So your audience is probably aware that by fidelity we mean providing the dosage that is what we intended, and also following kind of the critical or active ingredients in the curricular program. So I think some programs offer more flexibility for teachers to allow children to develop favorite games, right? Or read books that are more within their area of interest. Um, so I think having programs that are somewhat customizable is good, and I think where fidelity isn't is when teachers are not having a curriculum and it requires them to generate their own lessons on a day-to-day basis, and that's a big struggle, especially if you've got a lot of children in your classroom. And certainly since COVID and interrupted learning, we've got a lot more heterogeneity or an array of skills in our classrooms, where some kids had real positive experiences and were able to be in very good sort of preschool or home support settings, and other children unfortunately didn't have a successful learning process. And so I think the other thing that's we haven't touched on, that's another active ingredient within fidelity, is being able to have a good classroom management system, so kids know overall what's expected of them when they think pair share? What's expected of them when they're doing dialogic reading? What are the rules for social communication, or working with a peer? And in a lot of the work that we've done in Dallas recently, not through Friends on the Block, but through some of the other projects, our teachers are letting us know that not all of our kindergarten and first and second graders have experienced that. So they've had some behavioral surprises. And so some of that, some of what can make instruction more explicit or more intensive is providing more examples and giving feedback for appropriate and inappropriate kind of behavioral structures within the classroom. This is how we take turns, right?
Yeah. I'm so happy that you said that, and just got excited. Actually, in a lot of the professional development that we give, so we our readers know, and for you to know, Steph, we as the Windward Institute team provide professional development throughout the year. We work with a lot of schools on a consultant basis, and we go in and provide personalized PD. And a lot in the last year have been centered around how do you, of course, bring a structured literacy program to your school, and how do you bridge expectations with structures and routines so that students can access that material, right, and to learn better. And some of it has been start of the discussion maybe around executive functioning or classroom behavior. But I would say overall and by and large, we always fold in that work into our professional development because, if you're not creating an environment that's predictable, consistent, transparent, right, clear. I always like to name drop Brene Brown when she says clear is kind. Now, clear is kind was in her Daring Greatly book, yes, and Dare to Lead, and it was really about how you interact with colleagues and people that you manage. But I think about that as a teacher's perspective. Clear is kind to the students, right? It's kind to have these clear expectations and these modeling of routines for students, right? Because then they're more able to access what the learning environment would be. And I'm going to get off my soapbox, but as a former teacher, one of the biggest pieces I always worried about was my management, right? And, I wanted to make sure that I created an environment where students felt like they belonged, where they felt like they could act in a way to really actualize their learning. And it's one that, I think a lot of teachers I coach and continue to coach, one of their top things that they really worry about. So I really appreciate you bringing that in.
Yeah, we don't want to be the antecedent for the problem behavior as a teacher, right? And you don't know what fountains of strength kids are bringing and what might be triggering to them sometimes. So helping them learn a little more about self-regulation or modeling. Oh gosh, I'm going to just take a breath, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, that actually leads into our next part of the discussion. I have to just thank you for providing all that insights about interventions. It's just something that is really interesting to me personally, and one that I don't think we've spent a lot of time in on the podcast. So I really appreciate that's part of the conversation. But when we talk about self-regulation skills, I had mentioned belonging, self-efficacy, mindset. One of the pieces of your research that I really have appreciated was the role of motivation, social emotional learning, mindset. And for me as a teacher, a former teacher at Windward, I noticed, my students would come in and many of them would express that they had failed at their first academic job, learning to read. And when they arrived at Windward, it was this first opportunity for them to finally get that sense of agency, to experience teachers that cared for them and their abilities, that recognized their strengths and also taught a structured program for them to succeed. And so I always gravitated towards that research and all of the themes that existed in social emotional learning, how that integrated with literacy. And I know that you said something you're interested in. So let's talk about growth mindset research. Can you share some of the research that you've learned about how mindset relates to reading success?
Sure. I'm going to pull up again another slide over here that I wanted to be able to keep in mind. Yeah, I followed Carol Dweck's work, and I've also followed Angela Duckworth's work. So these sort of what appear to be non-academic mindsets, if you will. So the idea that students and teachers would believe that through effort and hard work that at learning to read that you will get better at it. And as she said, sometimes that doesn't follow for all kids, right? So you sort of have to hold space for them to see, and you have to attribute for them and identify when they're using things that are working and support them in continuing. And I think that can be particularly powerful when children might be facing stereotype threat, right? They might come in, as you say, with some more negative experiences. So we, with Jeannie and colleagues and I, including Yakov Petcher and Dr. Rivas and Dr. Jones or Dr. Go at SMU, we did some research at the fourth grade level, and we were able to see that with children who were struggling to learn to read, that we were providing intervention to, that their reading and global sort of mindset predicted their comprehension at the end of the year, even when we controlled for beginning of the year decoding. So we know that there are strong predictive relationships. There have been several meta-analyses that have shown that the predictive relationships are pretty solid, but it's really difficult to create a shift in mindset. So I think there are conversations about whether that's a trait, whether it's malleable. There certainly has been some constructive criticism of the way some mindset kind of interventions have been scaled before the research was ready. But I think for sure being able to incorporate aspects of behavioral wellness, social communication, being able to attribute your work to your improvement is helpful in the reading domain.
Would you say that there are, so let me pause and think about what you said and maybe check for understanding. Could you attribute then growth mindset as a protective factor of reading difficulty, or is
I,
it not enough research to say that?
I think it can be a part of resilience, right? I don't think that our goal is to necessarily shift people's mindset, but rather to kind of increase their self regulation and their academic success. So I think the effect sizes or those standard deviations of difference are somewhat smaller, but they may also accumulate across time. We don't have a lot of longitudinal research, and some of the work that's had stronger effects for mindset have been with older individuals, and it might be something as brief as a very short intervention that might be shown to be associated with much stronger academic records in college, or if students are involved in a large course, they might be less likely to drop out when they've been given a fairly brief intervention. So there haven't been uh, as many studies with younger students. So the work that we did at fourth grade was a little unusual. We also had the opportunity, Danielle, during the first year of COVID, to continue one of our trials where we supported kids, whether they were learning at home or in a school setting, with mindset, that was also kind of embedded with a dyslexia based program. And so we had some success with children, but the kids that were in the control group, the business as usual, were with their teachers or else learning with their teachers at home or in school. So it was a fairly small study, and that would be one that would need to be replicated. But this notion that kids had that, oh gosh, this is really hard for me, is what led our team here at SMU, to try to go in and curate a set of books that would be including many different types of learning goals for students. And we received a grant to train early childhood teachers how to use the evidence based strategy of dialogic reading to read aloud with their students and develop the kinds of vocabulary that folds in some of those learning skills that you've been talking about. So we chose a set of, eventually, with our school teaching partners, we chose a set of 20 books that teachers can buy easily through Amazon. They're sometimes part of the curriculum. They'd be available in a school or public library, sometimes on YouTube videos so that they could be shared with parents. And we had 5 particular themes. The first was I can name my feelings. So we had books about feelings, and we taught vocabulary like the word emotions, as well as some of the feelings. Um, I can learn from my mistakes, which sort of put positively is I can make good choices. I can persist. I can be kind to myself and others, and I can work for and achieve goals. So those are some large social and emotional learning skills. They're also social communication, and we train children on pretty ambitious vocabulary. And we've learned that pre-K3, pre-K4, kinder and first graders were able to really enjoy being read to by their teachers. This wasn't asking the kids to decode. And the teachers felt like that helped support their classroom management. Um, they asked us to create bookmarks so that the parents would be able to see what words and books they were using in school. And the vocabulary was pretty ambitious, especially for the little ones. But we're analyzing the data, and we saw some pretty big changes in behavior that the teachers attributed to uh, they're participating in the program and using the book. So I'll be able to, again, I'll share a slide that gives you an image of our scope and sequence and the units as so that we soft scripted lessons so that teachers wouldn't have to be scrambling. We printed off post-its that had dialogic reading questions that ranged from fairly simple, right in the book, to very abstract, connecting home and school. And I and provided them with a lot of picture-based vocabulary cards that a lot of them turned into their bulletin boards or to their calming corner, right?
Yeah. I love this, and I am so energized by this part of the conversation. I'm taking, again, copious notes. Now I've moved to the blank page of my questions.
Okay.
But I think in synthesizing a lot what you're talking about, and one and in this synthesis is reinforcing the lived experience of what it means to be a teacher, right? Is that
Yes.
we're teaching reading literacy skills through a structured approach and fostering this caring and community environment, right, where students can understand and practice emotional literacy, right, to learning from mistakes, persisting, being nice and kind, achieving their goals within a language-rich environment, right? When I have like this mind map in my mind, which is a good sign. I always it's a good sign in a read podcast when all of a sudden I feel like there are just a concept map is just spewing out of my head, right? But that you're really alluding to, not alluding to, but you're explicitly talking about this integrated approach to fostering these social emotional learning skills that are so integral to childhood learning and well-being, and attending to the reading strengths and skills and needs that so many students need, right? And so I hope that our readers are also putting those connections together, because it really is like, such a beautiful way, I think, to set up a classroom and to really foster those skills.
And if I can interject too, when we're speaking of fidelity, right? It's kind of like that line in the sand. So one of our pre-K4 teachers had the brilliant idea, rather than using the activities that we had prepared, she loved journaling with her students. So she would have the kids draw whatever the theme was for the week at the end of the week, instead of doing an activity we had prepared. And it was a great example of how she customized for her classroom community using a routine that she really wanted to promote. And we learned that maybe in her classroom, the specific activity wasn't capital F fidelity, right? That she sort of had a little bit of positive infidelity that we learned from. So I think, yeah, I think a lot of times teachers really buy into a program when they're not financially buy in, but they get excited, they get recharged when they're able to customize something for the strengths of the students in their classroom.
Yeah. Oof, I love that. So many
Yeah.
things to think about. We've talked about so much of your research, from interventions to this role of social emotional well-being, and really thinking about how you incorporate all these pieces in your classroom. In our limited time together, I think I felt like we've been together, like, both for 5 seconds, an entire day. I'm learning so much from you. But I really want to get to some of the broader implications and tie into what do we do now in terms of some advocacy work, larger systems work. And so in your experience and from your perspective and research, what gaps in literacy research still need to be addressed? And it could be ones that are timely and pressing to ones that you're hoping are addressed over the long term.
Well, I know you've had Dr. Devin Kearns before too, and he really speaks very strongly and eloquently to the type of system supports that are needed at a district level, at a school level, and what have you. And one of my nieces is an associate principal, and I think I've learned so much from her about some of the challenges that she's been facing in terms of having the supports in place for programs to stay and be tested as long as possible. I think a lot of times we think that something's fixed, or if it doesn't work immediately, we've got to change right away. And that's challenging. So I think for all of us, keeping our mind's eye and our advocacy on maintaining the science of reading and writing and math and science of learning right now is important. And I think there are some potential challenges with some of the regional labs going offline and some of the other supports for professional learning communities. So hopefully folks may have saved some of those documents and materials, and will continue to advocate for teachers and for kiddos. But the principals really are the leaders, and it, not every school offers the school leaders the decision making. A lot of times it's a district level decision. And so I hope that there'll be continued professional development as well for school leaders around the science of reading. And I remain concerned for our kiddos that might be receiving a 504 for accommodations or have IEP goals. I hope that our teachers will feel very supported by your work, and to be able to see from the data that what they're doing is really making a difference for kids.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And when you talked about school leaders, that's one that's of personal interest to us as well. It's one thing, it's important, obviously, to provide professional development across the system. And Jamie Williamson and I, our head of school at the Windward School, are also executive director of the Institute, host a Lead on Read podcast to tackle and wrestle some of those issues that come with increasing leaders' knowledge base around the science of reading, of ensuring that there are systems in place that help navigate change management principles, of thinking critically about resources and structures that might be in place to either facilitate or unfortunately may provide barriers to some of these change and this transformation. And so I really appreciated that you talked about at the end. Is there any area of research that you're interested in learning more about, or one that you're focusing some of your projects on?
I think that I'd like to keep learning more about database decision making in that systemic situation, not just database individualization for what we're doing in the classroom, but that along with the bigger dance steps of how do we all do this together. And I think there are so many different types of assessments that can be given either via technology, some that really still need to be given directly by a teacher. But how can we not just be collecting more information, but how can we get better at making sure that information, that data is actionable, so that a teacher would be able to develop those detective skills about a hypothesis of what might be done to make things more explicit, but also have data that's sensitive enough to growth over a short period of time, 4 to 6 weeks, so that you can see if what you're doing is working. So even if it means, taking informal information about what you're seeing during a day-to-day routine, I'd like to learn more how we can weave that information together in a more actionable way, so that teachers feel empowered and parents can see that and students themselves can see, hey, I'm growing as a reader. I'm
Yeah. Oof. Oh, that's so good. Yeah. Data is something that I think thematically we talk a lot about on Read, and one that we're interested as well. You spoke of Dr. Devin Kearns, and he was on our 5-year Read anniversary, and that was one piece that he talked about, right, is to emphasize the data on that piece. Is there anything that's exciting for you in the future of reading science and education? I'd like to leave our readers, with what gives you hope right now.
I think what gives me hope is that teachers are doing the very best that they can every day, and that we can support them. I think that gives me a lot of hope, and I feel like continuing to improve literacy outcomes is going to support workforce development. It's going to help us train the next generation of individuals to continue to lead and for changes that we can't even imagine. I don't feel when I'm training doctoral students that I'm training another me. I feel like I'm training them for their own journey. So I think that's another piece of resilience, is the next generation of teacher trainers and the kind of work that you and your team are doing to really embed that training on the job, but also make sure that we've got some good principles of how adults learn too.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. I like that a lot. Speaking of doctoral students, and I know when we talked about in our pre-read conversation, one of the things that you mentioned was that you're the editor of the Journal of Learning Disabilities, and I say doctoral students because guest editors were Doug and Lynn Fuchs, right? So you were their doctorate student.
Yes.
And now they're guest editors of the Journal of Learning Disabilities. That is so, talk about a full circle moment. But I did want to highlight this because Dr. Jeannie Wanzek is also an author of the papers. Can you share a little bit more about what that guest issue is going to be about?
Yeah, absolutely. I've actually got a tentative, this is going to come out in the summer. It's a paper. Several of the articles are going to be available in online first, and if they're not yet, they will be very soon. So the special series is looking at, it's 50 years since we first had Public Law 9442. So there's an article by Mitchell Yell and Renee Bradley about IDEA and clarifying misunderstood relationships between free and public education and least restrictive environments. Doug and Jeannie and Allison Gilmore have an article talking about special education policy and debates and inclusion over the past 50 years. Jess Namkung and Lynn Fuchs have an article relating to math, but specifically about vulnerability to achievement stressors that indicate students with learning disabilities will need more intensive intervention. Kristen McMaster and her team also have an article on supporting teachers' data-based individualization for writing. Dave Matthews, Elizabeth Bettini, and Bonnie Billingsley and Emily Burns have an article coming out about educators' perspectives on working conditions. We've been talking about supporting teachers. And then the last article in the series will be about student teaching placements, initial teaching positions, and that's by Ben Ox and James Cowson, Dan Goldhaber, and Roddy Theobald, and Jesu Jin. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. But that I'll send you a copy of the table of contents, Danielle, and I think it's going to be really an interesting special series looking back over 5 decades.
Yeah. Wow. What a robust issue. And I think, yes, it's 50 years since IDEA had passed, and it can't be more timely, right, in how we're navigating education right now and policy. So I'm so excited to dive into that. It's just going to be such a summer of learning and thinking about how do we move forward. So I'll end with this. Dr. Otaiba, I feel so incredibly lucky to be talking to you right now. I mean, this is such a joy. I've learned so much from you. I'm so energized. So thank you so much for offering your time and your expertise for the Read podcast.
Thank you. I've learned so much from you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you to all our Read listeners for listening to this episode with Dr. Stephanie Otaiba. To learn more about this episode or about Dr. Otaiba's work, you can visit our website at thewindwardschool.org/WI. There you'll find our media resources. I also said in the beginning, and Dr. Otaiba had mentioned, that Dr. Jeannie Wanzek is going to be joining us at Windward. So if you are in the New York tri-state area, we invite you to come to where we will be hosting Dr. Wanzek Live, and all the information to sign up will be posted if you're watching this on YouTube. And if you're not on Zoom, you're listening on all of our podcast platforms, you can also just go to the Windward School's website for more information to sign up. We also invite you to engage with us. So if you have any ideas of topics and speakers, feel free to email me at info@readpodcast.org. You can also stay engaged with us on social media, from LinkedIn to Facebook to Instagram, and we look forward to learning with you. So Dr. Otaiba, thank you so much. For our final send-off, I always ask my guests to say until next time, readers. So will you delight us in saying until next time, readers?
Until next time, readers.